I grew up on the reservation, so my identity is I'm Northern Cheyenne, and my identity is complex because I got bussed off the reservation and went to a predominantly white school. And so I would come home and have native culture, and then I would be bussed off and be immersed in dominant culture with English language. Come home, and my dad's first language is Cheyenne. I think my identities as a Mennonite and a Northern Cheyenne, I think they always go back and forth. They're constantly conflicting and they're constantly going together. But there's a lot of similarities, especially within this psychology of peace and peacemaking and reconciliation and restorative justice. Yet at the same time, there's some conflict because within the Christian community, it's still, I would say, from my own opinion, like predominantly the thought that you are a native or a Christian. You can't really be both. And so if you want to be a Christian, you give up your native identity. I grew up in Montana, but if you think about where tribes are now on reservations, that's only a portion of the land they occupied. So we were nomadic people, and our range would have been up into Canada, down into Kansas, Minnesota, that whole little loop. We were considered a plains tribe. And so through the process of colonization, then we get pushed to this little section of land on Montana. But a lot of our sacred sites, some are in Wyoming and some are in South Dakota. And so, and even down in Denver, we had the Sand Creek Massacre. And so our sacred sites and the places in which we memorialize cover a huge area. And we also have our other relatives, the Southern Cheyenne, live in Oklahoma because we were separated during the process of termination and all that stuff.
Our tradition is kind of rooted in being refugees, leaving Europe to find a safe place. And my family name is Stout. The Stouts and the Orsburns migrated west, and they tried North Dakota, and then they tried Texas, and they ended up here. So I have some photographs in the house, back from the early years of my family's time here. And you point to it with pride, and say, oh, we were hard stuff. We came here and settled and survived. And I took these photographs to a self-service frame shop in Seattle, and I needed help. And I asked the manager if he could help me out, and he looked at him and he goes, I have pictures like these. I go, really? Yeah, that's interesting. No. I mean, I know these people. We started comparing notes, and we're from the same valley. We had grown up together and didn't know each other. But he was the grandson of a woman who was the last native in the area to remember life before the settlers came. So she was pretty famous. And it was kind of a mystery that we didn't know each other, and we spent probably 5 hours that day just talking. But one of the things he did is he looked at that photograph and goes, he looked me in the eye and goes, your people killed my people.
European descendants benefit from a violent history of land grabbing and genocide that was justified by patriotism and religion. This same theology formed an international legal structure that continues to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their land. What does it mean to be a peacemaker today, in a world where the present is defined by the violence of the past?
My grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with, and at one point he took me up to a place west of here, an area in the Tayat, and he said, yeah, we brought about 1,500 head of cattle in here, and we're going to let them rest. But then he walked to the edge of the meadow, and he pointed to some trees, and he said, and we found 2 Indians hanging from that tree. And I could tell, it was serious. And I asked him why, I mean, in a lot of the western lore, we have cowboys and Indians fighting it out, but the reality of this coming from my grandfather, pointing to the tree where it happened, was a little shocking. And he said, well, we're taking their land and they want it back.
In the simplest terms, the doctrine of discovery is the idea under international law that when a European Christian country was the first European to discover new lands, they had a legal right to that area.
The Doctrine of Discovery defined anybody who is not Christian as less than human and unworthy of land ownership.
The doctrine of discovery, as practiced, is evil. It provided that only those who know Christ are to be the chosen people. And it indicated that those who did not know Christ, who were not baptized, were heathens and had no souls and were animals. As a result of that, those heathens and animals could not own, possess, manage, or use their own indigenous lands.
There is no question that religion was a major part of the Doctrine of Discovery and justification from the European viewpoint as to why they were predominant and dominant, and God intended for European Christians to have the whole world. And in the famous or infamous papal bulls in 1452 and in 1455, the Pope orders Portugal to invade, subdue the Saracen, and which was their word for Muslim, and the pagan of any of whatsoever, take their property, take their lives, govern them, rule them, take. The popes created these papal bulls and started this development of the Doctrine of Discovery. But this was not a Catholic Church-specific movement. The idea of acquiring the lands and rights of indigenous peoples was very much just a European idea, and maybe greed, let's say the word outright. Queen Elizabeth I is the best example. She was an excommunicated Catholic. She authorized English expeditions to North America to attempt the first English colonies in North America. She complied with the papal bulls, even though she was no longer Catholic. And so she ordered Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who were the first Englishmen authorized by the Crown to attempt colonies in what's now the United States. And I can quote you the phrase, she told them, "Go where no Christian prince has yet been, and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title."
And so the race was on for European monarchs to discover and claim as much of the New World as possible in the name of Christ.
Terra nullius is also an aspect of the Doctrine of Discovery, and there's two aspects of terra nullius. If land was completely empty and no human lives there, when a European power arrived there, they claimed it.
But that wasn't the case when Columbus landed in what is now San Salvador. We were an estimated, in North and South America, 95 million natives. When the era of extermination by the United States of native peoples ended, we were less than 1 million people. And what happened to all of our ancestors who had a right to live here? Their rights should not have been subjugated by the Doctrine of Discovery.
But Europeans were pretty intelligent, or should I say sneaky, about interpreting the Doctrine of Discovery in their own favor. So even if there were human beings where they landed, they still said this land is terra nullius if these people are not using the land in a way European legal systems approve. If they aren't farming, if they aren't using the land to the best and highest use, then that land is terra nullius and is vacant, quote unquote, and available for claim and acquisition by a European power.
In service to the state, the European settlers had a mandate to subdue and improve the land, to make it productive by European standards.
Productive land is considered land that was arable, that was farmed, that wasn't rocky and dry and hardpan. It's the kind of soil that can be built up over years and years of good farming practices. And Mennonites were known as good farmers. For centuries, they were developing these kinds of crop rotations, and the ways that they were doing agriculture built up soil. So they were often invited in by governments in countries that wanted land reclaimed.
When we fought our Revolutionary War with England and we signed that treaty in 1783, England granted the United States all its proprietary property rights in North America, south of Canada, and east of the Mississippi. Indian peoples went either to President Jefferson and to later leaders and said, we want to become U.S. citizens. We want you to give us the fee simple titles to our lands because it's the only way to protect and keep our lands. The American politicians immediately started backpedaling. My own tribe, which was in Ohio in 1817, signed a treaty with the United States in which the treaty negotiators with our tribe made a mistake. And in the treaty it said, you will have the fee simple title to your lands. And when that treaty went to the Senate, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it because they said, we're not going to give Indians and Indian tribes the fee simple or full ownership of their lands. And so our treaty was changed the next year in 1818 because the Congress refused to ratify that idea of giving us fee simple lands. The Doctrine of Discovery was brought into American law and jurisprudence in 1823 by our most famous Chief Justice, John Marshall. Of course, there was no Indian on either side, the plaintiff or the defendant. So it was non-Indians fighting over what used to be Indian land. The plaintiff, Mr. Johnson, his grandfather, had bought land directly from tribes that's now in the Illinois and Indiana area. Mr. McIntosh, however, had bought some of the same land from the United States, who had signed a treaty with those same tribes, and that's how the United States claimed to have acquired the land. And the United States Supreme Court said the tribes lost the ultimate title when Europeans showed up. They cannot sell their lands to whomever they wish. They can only sell their lands to the discovering European power. Even when American Indians became Christians, and even if they became civilized according to the definition of American society, it didn't really seem to change the American goal, which was to acquire all the assets of tribal peoples.
The Congressional Act of 1830, the Indian Removal Act that was passed by Congress and signed by President Andrew Jackson. And then there were subsequent treaties in Illinois and Indiana which really directly affected the Potawatomi who were here. And so some of the removals were forced. Well, the Trail of Death was one of those forced removals that took place and involved approximately 800 people, and there were something like 40 deaths. The removal started because the people thought they were coming into a meeting, and the meeting was going to be held in a little chapel, and they thought this is good. But then the government then proceeded to collect Potawatomi in about a 50-mile radius area. And the leaders who were in the church at the time were actually then put into a makeshift jail cell on a wagon and were led for approximately, from north central Indiana clear to Danville, Illinois. And it wasn't until they got to Danville where they were released.
So my family, my Amish ancestors came to Pennsylvania in the early 1700s and settled on indigenous land. And then about 100 years later, they moved to Ohio and settled on indigenous land that had been recently cleared by the U.S. military. And that's kind of a horrifying story.
The horrors of clearing land for European settlers became a part of U.S. government policy that attempted to destroy the culture and life ways of indigenous peoples, including decimating the buffalo population and other food sources, coercing them onto reservations, and compelling them to assimilate into the dominant culture.
I always, when I look through the different processes in which they were trying to kill the Indian, save the man, I can't believe we still retained what we have, because they tried everything, and it's genius. It's horribly genius to take little kids at a young age to boarding school and make them speak English and then make them return to their communities where they don't understand the language. And it's genius to make people poor and fight over things, and all these different processes that still keep happening, yet we still have our culture.
This is our mother's world. The birds and carols raise. The morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise.
When we were children, we grew up, we were ordered by the government to go to Bible school. So I grew up learning a lot about the Bible. And although I didn't like being a Christian, I had to learn those things. And some things remain in your mind and your heart forever. For example, we learned that it is God's teaching through His Son that I will be with you till the end of time. And all that I have taught that is good, you are obligated to teach that to others. What is good about the doctrine of discovery? What is good about enslavement? What is good about killing other people? What is good about infanticide and genocide? God didn't teach that. The church taught that.
The church turned to Scripture to find justifications for the doctrine of discovery.
Looking at the story of the promised land. So this idea of a covenant people coming out of Exodus and being justified in taking over the land of Canaan, where the inhabitants are put to death because the covenant people have a sort of divine mandate and right to go and conquer and slaughter.
It's very important to bring it in its historical context. And it's very important also to ask the questions about power. So when we go back and read the biblical texts in their historical context, we start to recognize that these texts start to take their final form when the people of Israel were actually colonized or imperialized by the Babylonians. So when people bring in the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, without recognizing the power difference between a Christian interpreter who lives in Europe or North America and the power they possess versus the ancient Israelites who were oppressed by these other powers around them. This is where the problem starts, because people don't recognize the historical context of the text and their own historical context in which they are the powerful. And they misuse and abuse the text of the powerless to justify the acts of the powerful.
The other one is Romans 13, and a biblical text that kind of justifies, God has put in place authority, and God has given the sort of rulers on the earth are the ones who carry out the commands of God. And so through the doctrine of discovery, you see these kind of divinely sanctioned rulers and kings who are carrying out God's purposes on earth without a whole lot of question of what they're doing.
The doctrine of discovery, of course, comes out of the 15th century and was used as a vehicle for colonization. But it's part of a pattern that goes back really to the very beginning of writing itself, both in the Bible and in texts outside the Bible. Well, I refer to this as this pattern of the religion of empire and the religion of creation. In the religion of empire, God is understood as a force that exists primarily in the civilized context, so in the city. So you look at ancient empires and they had a royal palace and a temple for their god, usually connected. And the connection highlights that the god is there to justify the king and the king's authority over the people. The king is often understood as in the place of the god, or even in some traditions as the god itself. What I also want to contrast is the way that Jesus took up a tradition that existed throughout the entire Hebrew Bible that I call the religion of creation, which is the exact opposite. So that's a tradition that instead of arising out of the city, arises out of people's relationship with the earth itself, and sees all people as part of a common human family. So biblically speaking, we could look to Genesis 1, and they're created in harmony with an earth which is also considered good. So these two paradigms of religion of empire and religion of creation battle throughout all of history. Jesus clearly sides with the religion of creation against the religion of empire. So, for example, he does not support the Jerusalem temple as the place where God is. He leads his disciples up a mountain to experience God. He experiences God in the wilderness or in the river.
The third theological justification behind the doctrine of discovery coming out of the papal bulls, and you see this in Manifest Destiny as well as the Great Commission. So Matthew 28 is when Jesus sends out his disciples and says, "Go therefore into all the world, make disciples of all nations."
My Christian theology centers around Jesus Christ, who accompanied the powerless and the oppressed. Jesus who died an unjust death, but was raised from the dead, vindicated and justified by God, shows us that our calling as Christians is to actually serve others rather than dominate them.
More recently, I started connecting that to the way I grew up and realized I lived the doctrine of discovery. Like my whole reality on the reservation is a result of the doctrine of discovery.
The impacts of the doctrine of discovery are very real today and continue to disempower Indigenous peoples. They face pressure to concede to resource extraction that threatens their very existence, even on reservation lands.
They're running out of surface level coal in the coal mine, and so we live on a rich deposit of coal, which is like surface level, like the easy to get to stuff that's good. And so they're constantly trying to hit us up with putting railways through and different things like that, and extracting our resources, our timber, which would affect, the mining would affect our aquifers, and they wanted to do some fracking and some coal bed methane extraction. And so far, none of that has happened. But they're constantly asking, and yeah, but it's a constant battle because people still need to eat. People need water, your basic needs. And if someone offers you money, it's almost, what do you do?
Resource extraction, especially mining, decimates the land and makes it uninhabitable. This is happening around the world as economic development displaces Indigenous peoples while benefiting outsiders. A prime example is occurring now in Suriname, South America.
So Suriname was settled by the Dutch, and when Suriname declared independence from the Netherlands, the ownership of all of that land was transferred from the government of the Netherlands to the government of Suriname. And so the state, the national governing body in Suriname, owns title to all of the land. And that transfer took place as a direct result of the doctrine of discovery. So as technology has improved and it's gotten easier and less expensive to go deeper and deeper into the rainforest, the desire to be enriched by that resource has grown, and that includes logging, taking gold out of the soil, mining for bauxite and other minerals.
Used in gold mining, mercury is a known neurotoxin that causes serious health problems and even death. Mercury travels through the food chain and even upstream to communities far from gold mining.
Pemide go to manote ete. Tok mi abi kwek mi edesi alaski. Wa American go dape anga tourisme. E sori mi ataki awani luko sikisani. Aini miskin. Datere mitaki anga disi American. Anong mi wawang luko miskin. Mi foluko abiete. Kane anong mi foluko awani sikitu.
The Wayana people of Apatina, Suriname collected samples of their own hair to test for mercury. They found that every single person tested had unsafe levels of mercury, and many were dangerously high.
My name is Joan van der Bos. My first name is Joan. Mina solek fa usabi lanti sap mina eerste uma kapten fuser nanin de ingi dorpu. Desma fujaso elip fu prani, visi, onti. Ja, na de dupti landbouw, na dat na de libi. Over agrontori mi wan taki. Ade wan bigi sari gimi. Ef mi musluku va umbusi Lanti ne hori kaninitis na nga uno a overhead. Tak mo betrek eerst den smasa dena in de buurt voor a busi dat sami si tak vrij kom go accident even. If de gebruik a busi dat. Maar zonder inspraak voor uno, gewoon de densrevetek den besluit. Begin gisma beschikking na bakasi. En op sanina regering voor disi, op sanina regering voor jaren 70. Zonder medeweten voor het dorp, presi ei prati. En te a prati, dat de ne tego next to na teo si bepaalde sansa de man e begin do. Dat tego erna, dat je erachter dat je ziet, oh, a presidis prati. En wie speel go klop, dat hij tak nee, volgens de grondwet. Te was makis papieren, akis beschikking tapagrong, dat je ano a recht hebbende, sa je go actie a presi baka, iwana presi baka, dat je in strijd met de wet. De meer actie misref nu, pe onrechte delik ingi.
Within this legal structure, international development, economic arrangements, economic treaties, they're based in the assumption that some people have the right to own and control territories and lands and other people do not.
Kawisay agaw kun sa kayo amin. A pleasant day to all of you. I am Pia Making Malayaw, and I am an indigenous Bontoc Igorot from the mountain province, which is in northern Philippines. I am part of CAMP. It is a National Alliance of Indigenous Peoples organization here in our country. The Spanish colonizers imposed the Regalian Doctrine. This is similar, if not the same, to the General Doctrine of Discovery, which also declared the entire Philippines as owned by the King of Spain. During the post-colonial government, the Regalian Doctrine was retained. The Philippine Constitution declares that all resources in our lands, in the Philippine territory, are owned by the state. So if we would look at the issue of mining, with liberalized mining institutionalized by the Mining Act of 1995, which practically allows for up to 100% foreign ownership of our mineral resources and our mineral lands, actually poses the biggest threat currently to our rights to ancestral land.
But there's hope when Indigenous people hold the title to their ancestral lands.
I lived in the Philippines with a host family of Indigenous people who were Ikalahan Kalangoya was the name of the tribe. You could see the outlines of the ancestral domain, like the literal borders of it by the forested area, and all around it was like logged, and all around the outside lots of erosion and landslides. But the ancestral domain, because the Indigenous peoples there had gotten a secure land tenure agreement, the Ikalahan Kalangoya were able to protect their forests, and I began to see kind of the importance of land title for Indigenous people.
There is international recognition that Indigenous peoples should have rights to their lands, but change is slow. In 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. However, while this was a major milestone, the declaration is not universal law. Rather, it is merely suggestions for countries to put into law. Not surprisingly, only a few countries have implemented these recommendations. For most Indigenous people, this document is simply a piece of paper. It hasn't resulted in titles of their ancestral lands.
As a scientist myself, not only am I a rancher, but I'm a toxicologist. And as I start entering into conversations about the issues and the causes and move out of the technical field, it's almost impossible to introduce the language of morality. What happens? As a scientist, if I talk about values, my work is diminished. If an economist talks about values, their work is diminished. It's considered biased. If a politician, deals with these, he's got this big, they have these different accountabilities they have to deal with. Everybody is paralyzed and incapable of engaging in topics of morality, of right and wrong. The only community of people on Earth today that can deal with these structural issues that are global in scale is the ecumenical community. And my question is, where are they?
Every white settler ought to know about where I live. Whose land was this before colonization? How did they lose it? By what mechanism and when? And where are their descendants today? Now that last question opens up a whole range of possibilities for relationship. If their descendants are still alive somewhere today, I could find out how they felt about this land, how they felt about losing it. How are things going for them today?
And Rich's, one of his drives and concerns is that he and others are living in northern Indiana on what once was Potawatomi turf.
What needs to be returned to its rightful owner, what needs to be restored. I think that this is a really scary one for Mennonites, a scary one for me to think of, not knowing really what that might look like.
But visiting the past is very difficult. It's very painful. And for the two groups that are involved, visiting the past brings two emotions that I think are very important to address. Visiting the past is painful for those who have been oppressed because it reminds them of how their ancestors were dispossessed of the land. It reminds them also of their present, that they feel like they are caught in this cycle of oppression and there is no way out of it. Visiting the past for those who come from a European descent can be painful as it recalls this emotion of shame. And they think it is difficult to visit the past because they don't want to deal with this shame. So as we seek liberation and reconciliation between the different communities that live here in North America, and as we long to empower those who are marginalized, we need to talk about the pain and the suffering, and we need to talk about the fear of being ashamed.
You may get comments like, I got your people killed my people. It's like, yeah, I think I understand that. But you can carry on the conversation. And you can, on one hand, be in good relationship with the people you know, but on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that these structures are still in place and they're still happening. And it's not okay to go, I'm a good person. And within my community, I'm doing well, and within the people I know, I treat with respect. No, we have to become more than the quiet on the land.
I'd like to think I had the answers, but I don't. But I want to be in dialogue with other people and to listen, to learn from each other. I believe that we as a church can, through that process, then make decisions that will change and affect our attitudes and actions that we have with people here in North America, as well as people in other parts of the world. The result is really carrying out our commitment to being people who act with peace and justice as a primary purpose. And by doing that, we enact part of God's righteousness, which is putting things to right, even though we don't know what those are like at the moment.
There's so much wisdom of Indigenous people that we desperately need. We might not realize how desperate the need is yet. We might be under the illusion that our Western mentality of that technology will solve all ills will fix things, but it will not restore us to a relationship with the earth that's healthy, to the whole life way of Indigenous peoples.
And mi wantak unus mus bapalu on twekaling tras mafudoro se muskong tak songan-san wan dunin dorp en imus de ins na unus filek ingi muskonin overleg tak uloba on twekaling dati dan pas we stem tuma smafudoro se muskona tak if they can go to the of art o liwat dan ook of boxit na unulek inheemse bestuur of inheemse leiders moest kunnen taferada taki. Samen na bevolking, inspraak voor bevolking. En voor de eens of niet, dan pas lanti ukan tegi lanti sa uwani, dan pas akan te kwam beslissen, maar anom teken tape eentje uno wana sandat.
And I hope that you can join us in our campaign to stop the killings of indigenous peoples and to immediately repeal the operational plan Bayanihan, which is in disguise of peace and development, which actually is still continuing to violate the civil and political rights of the indigenous peoples, which is very linked to the economic interest in our ancestral lands.
The moment you meet the children or the elderly or the people in these communities that are suffering, once you know them, you are obligated to do something. There is no turning back. It's not enough to wait for your heart to change. You have to change it and act.
But let me frame this in a question. Would it have been enough to say that slavery was not a doctrine of Christ and that spiritually we needed to align ourselves in some repudiation statement and say that we do not believe in slavery? Is that enough? Is it good enough to stop there? To just say, well, we know that it's not a doctrine of Christ. At some point, you also have to do away with that structure. You have to do away with the legal arrangement that makes it possible for one human being to own another. And the church was very involved in overcoming that structure. The Doctrine of Discovery is the same. We have a legal arrangement where certain peoples have inherited the right to dominate and own land, and other peoples do not have those rights.
How can Indigenous people be heard as they ask for the rights they justly deserve? We, who live with power and privilege, can stand beside them and speak out. We can ask for the social change that is so desperately needed.
Churches are powerful, whether they want to be or not. And we can do our own part as Native people, but it's like we still need these organizations, and churches are systems, they're all over the U.S., they're global.
And global action is needed. We know that land theft and resource extraction is happening in our neighborhoods and around the world. Our planet is being exploited and pillaged for economic development. It is time to act in solidarity with those who are the brunt of these actions, the Indigenous peoples of the world.
I actually have to be part of working side by side with Indigenous communities as they imagine a world in which they have rights, and to struggle with them as they seek those rights. And I'm participating in that.
Sarah Augustine and Doug Hostetter spoke on behalf of the Wayana people at the Organization of American States Commission on Human Rights.
Doug Hostetter will present to you next a photo essay that he has created from his time on the Human Rights Delegation in 2011 when he accompanied Suriname Indigenous Health Fund to the interior of Suriname. He is the director of the Mennonite Central Committee, United Nations Office.
In one generation, a mining of gold has poisoned and polluted the rivers and destroyed their ability to earn, to be able to survive on those rivers. I hope that you act before it is too late. I thank you.
I just want to ask you and plead with you to consider the recommendations that we've made in our request to advocate for the survival of the Wayana people.
Love is about caring for your brothers and sisters, your community, and majority of the people in your society. Love will flourish not just by ending the militarization of our communities, nor by the simple absence of violence. It is in our search for social justice and genuine recognition of our collective rights to ancestral land and self-determination that we find and develop love.
So my hope is that people of faith, especially people of faith like myself, who have a story of being white settlers, and what I mean by that is, our ancestors came to this country and settled on land that had been indigenous land, native land. I hope that we can use those stories and not get paralyzed by them, but use those stories to fuel our action for social justice right now. What does it mean for me now to have benefited from the wealth and security that my family enjoyed as a result of having that land and farming on it for decades? What does it mean for me to take that privilege and now use it to stand alongside people who are being dispossessed of their land right now? So that's the thing. Colonization is happening right now. And there's people right now who need others to come along beside them and help them in their fight for justice.
And I have a lot of hope in Mennonites because Mennonites consider themselves of the land as well. And there's a lot of farmers. And if anyone in the world is going to feel the connection to the land beyond Indigenous people, I feel like that is a point of connection because they seem to love the land as well. And so I have a lot of hope there, and I just want Mennonites to find that hope and to not get scared of these stories of the railroads coming in and pushing natives off, and then the next immediate population to come in are usually the Mennonites. Because they are considered the peaceful of the land, but not to get scared of that, like move beyond that, to get involved in any way you can, whether it's just personally or in your own little family or teaching your kids differently or just to be encouraged and find ways of being involved and staying involved.
Because I think what was done in the name of Christ, the Doctrine of Discovery was done in the name of Christ, needs to be undone in the name of Christ.